OpenAI did not lose control in a crisis. It lost control the moment it decided no one should have it. In December 2015, a group of technologists announced a new artificial intelligence lab. The structure they chose was deliberate. OpenAI would be a nonprofit. No shareholders, no equity, no owners. This was presented as a solution to a problem. If AI became powerful enough to reshape civilization, who should control it? The answer OpenAI gave was no one. The logic seemed sound. Corporations optimize for profit. Governments optimize for power. OpenAI would optimize for safety. It would be governed by a board with a single mandate: ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits all of humanity. This was not ideology, it was architecture. The board would have absolute authority. It could hire, it could fire, it could shut the whole operation down if it determined the technology had become too dangerous. No investors could overrule it. No executives could ignore it. The structure was designed to concentrate control in the hands of people who could not be influenced by financial incentive. There was no mechanism for profit extraction. There was no path to an acquisition. There was no equity to buy. OpenAI was built to be ungovernable by the forces that typically govern technology companies. This looked like protection. It was actually vulnerability. The board had authority, but authority is not the same as power. Authority is what a structure grants you on paper. Power is what you can enforce when the structure breaks. OpenAI's board had total authority over an organization that would soon require resources it could not generate alone. Nonprofits are not built to burn billions of dollars on compute. They are not built to compete with Google and Meta in a race where the cost of relevance doubles every 18 months. OpenAI's governance model assumed the organization would remain small, careful, and academic. It did not. By 2018, OpenAI's research had produced results that made scaling look viable. The models were improving faster than expected. Talent was expensive. Compute was expensive. The nonprofit structure that once seemed like an ethical advantage now looked like a resource ceiling. The board faced a choice. It could slow down and stay independent, or it could raise capital and lose control slowly. There was no third option. Neutrality requires resources, and resources require compromise. In 2019, OpenAI restructured. It created a for-profit subsidiary capped at 100x returns. Investors could fund the work, but they could not own the mission. The board would still govern. The nonprofit would still control the for-profit arm. This was framed as a hybrid model that preserved OpenAI's values while unlocking the capital needed to compete. It was not a compromise. It was a countdown. The new structure created something unstable. The board retained authority, but the for-profit entity now had obligations. Obligations to investors, obligations to employees, obligations to partners. These obligations did not override the board's power legally, but they constrained it practically. The board could still fire the CEO, it could still shut down the lab, but doing so now meant breaching expectations that had financial and operational consequences. Authority without leverage is not control. It is the appearance of control inside a system that has already moved on. Microsoft entered this structure in 2019. It did not ask for board seats. It did not demand equity. It made an investment that looked like partnership and felt like insurance. OpenAI got capital and compute. Microsoft got access and alignment. The deal was presented as a way to preserve OpenAI's independence. It was actually the moment independence became impossible. The board believed it still governed OpenAI because the legal documents said it did. But governance is not just what you can authorize. It is what you can enforce. And OpenAI had just made itself dependent on a partner whose interests would not always align with the board's mandate. This was not corruption, it was architecture. OpenAI built a structure where control could not concentrate, resources could not scale, and authority could not convert to leverage. It built a system where no one could legally hold power, which meant the organization would eventually be governed by whoever could not be removed. Microsoft did not take control because it was aggressive. It took control because it became the only entity OpenAI could not function without, and the board did not lose authority. It lost relevance. OpenAI's real weakness was governance without ownership, authority without resources, oversight without the ability to sustain independence. The board was designed to prevent capture, but capture does not require a hostile takeover. It only requires dependency. Microsoft's investment in OpenAI was announced in 2019 as a billion-dollar partnership. The framing was careful. This was not an acquisition. This was not a controlling stake. Microsoft would provide capital and cloud infrastructure. OpenAI would remain independent. The nonprofit board would retain full authority. The deal included no equity transfer. Microsoft did not get board seats. It did not get voting rights. On paper, it looked like OpenAI had solved the funding problem without compromising governance. It had not. What Microsoft received was not ownership. It was something more durable. The investment came with 3 conditions that would prove more valuable than equity. First, Azure exclusivity. OpenAI would run all of its workloads on Microsoft's cloud platform, every model, every training run, every deployment. OpenAI could not move to another cloud provider without rebuilding its entire operational foundation. Migration was not forbidden, it was simply prohibitively expensive. Second, compute credits. Microsoft provided access to the computational resources required to train large language models. These credits were tied to Azure. As OpenAI scaled, its dependency on Microsoft deepened automatically. The more successful OpenAI became, the more it relied on Microsoft. Third, intellectual property access. Microsoft received the right to integrate OpenAI's models into its own products. It could build features, it could launch services, it could commercialize the technology without asking for permission each time. None of these terms gave Microsoft formal authority over OpenAI's research direction. None of them granted veto power over safety decisions. None of them allowed Microsoft to overrule the board. But formal authority is not the only kind of power that matters. OpenAI's models required compute at a scale that few organizations on Earth could provide. Training GPT-3 cost millions of dollars in infrastructure. Training GPT-4 would cost tens of millions. Microsoft was not the only cloud provider, but it was the only one offering credits on terms that made OpenAI's roadmap viable. This created a quiet asymmetry. Microsoft needed OpenAI to succeed because it had invested heavily. But Microsoft could survive if OpenAI failed. OpenAI needed Microsoft to operate. It had no alternative at the scale required. If Microsoft withdrew support, OpenAI would have to slow down, restructure, or find another partner willing to subsidize billions in compute. The board still had the authority to fire executives, change strategy, or shut down research that seemed unsafe. But exercising that authority now carried a cost the board did not fully control. If OpenAI's leadership changed abruptly, would Microsoft continue the partnership? If OpenAI paused development for safety reasons, would Microsoft wait? This was not a trap, it was an incentive structure. Microsoft had not restricted OpenAI's decision-making. It had made certain decisions expensive and others cheap. Expensive decisions included anything that disrupted the partnership. Cheap decisions included anything that aligned with Microsoft's product roadmap. The board did not lose authority, it gained constraints. Authority without the ability to exercise it freely is not the same as control. It is conditional governance. Microsoft also gained something OpenAI did not fully anticipate. As models improved, enterprises wanted access. OpenAI could license directly, but that required building sales infrastructure, compliance systems, and enterprise support. Microsoft already had these. It could offer OpenAI's technology through Azure OpenAI Service. Customers got the models. Microsoft got the relationship. This looked efficient. It was also a transfer. Microsoft now controlled how most of OpenAI's technology reached commercial users. It set pricing. It managed access. It handled support. OpenAI retained the brand, but Microsoft owned the distribution channel. Distribution is leverage. When customers depend on you for access to something, you control whether that thing remains accessible. OpenAI still owned its models legally, but Microsoft controlled whether those models could reach the market at scale. By 2023, OpenAI's revenue was growing rapidly. ChatGPT had become a cultural phenomenon, but the business model depended entirely on infrastructure and distribution that Microsoft controlled. OpenAI could not switch cloud providers without months of downtime. It could not reclaim enterprise distribution without building capabilities from scratch. The board still believed it governed OpenAI because the governance documents had not changed. But governance is not just what you can authorize, it is what you can do when interests diverge. And OpenAI had built a system where diverging from Microsoft was technically possible but operationally unaffordable. Microsoft did not buy OpenAI, it made OpenAI impossible to operate without it. That is a more durable form of control than equity. Equity can be diluted, partnerships can be terminated, but dependency is structural. It does not require enforcement. The investment Microsoft made was not a bet on ownership, it was a bet on indispensability. On November 17, 2023, OpenAI's board fired Sam Altman. The decision was made quickly. Altman was informed in the afternoon. By evening, the announcement was public. The board stated that Altman had not been consistently candid in his communications. No further detail was provided. The board believed it was exercising the authority it was designed to hold. It had determined that leadership was not aligned with the organization's mission. It acted. The board was doing exactly what the structure said it could do. The structure was correct. The authority was real. But authority only matters if the system you govern can function after you use it. Within hours, OpenAI's employees began circulating a letter. The message was direct. If Altman was not reinstated, they would resign and follow him to Microsoft. More than 700 employees signed. That was nearly the entire company. The board had fired the CEO. The employees had fired the board. Legally, the employees had no standing. Practically, they had all of it. Microsoft responded within 24 hours. Satya Nadella announced that Microsoft would hire Altman and any OpenAI employees who wanted to join. The company would create a new advanced AI research lab. The message was calm. There was no ultimatum. Microsoft simply made clear that it had an alternative ready. This was not a threat. It was a clarification. If OpenAI's board wanted to reset leadership, Microsoft would continue with or without OpenAI. The partnership was valuable, but it was not irreplaceable. Microsoft had the compute. It had the distribution. It had access to OpenAI's models through the existing agreement. What it needed was the talent, and the talent had just declared its loyalty. The board had assumed that firing Altman would lead to a transition. A new CEO would be named. The organization would stabilize. This assumption depended on employees accepting the board's authority. They did not. The board's authority was legal. The employees' leverage was operational. When those two forces conflicted, operational leverage won. This was not rebellion. It was a system revealing where power actually resided. OpenAI's structure had been designed to concentrate authority in the board. But authority is only meaningful if the people it governs cannot afford to leave. OpenAI's employees could leave. They had an immediate alternative. The board had one option left. It could hold its position and watch the organization collapse, or it could reverse course. Within 5 days, Altman was reinstated. The board was restructured. New members were added. The ones who had led the decision were replaced. The outcome looked like a failure of governance. It was actually a failure of leverage. The board had authority, but authority without enforcement mechanisms is ceremonial. The board could fire Altman, but it could not prevent Microsoft from hiring him. It could not stop employees from leaving. This was not sabotage. It was clarification. The board discovered that it governed an organization it did not control. Control had migrated to the entities that could not be bypassed. Microsoft could not be bypassed because OpenAI needed its infrastructure. Employees could not be bypassed because they were the infrastructure. The board's authority had been real in 2015 when OpenAI was small and not yet dependent on external resources. By 2023, the organization had obligations the board could not unilaterally manage. Obligations to investors who expected returns. Obligations to employees who expected stability. Obligations to Microsoft, which had funded the compute that made everything possible. The board retained the legal right to govern, but legal rights do not determine outcomes when operational realities conflict with them. Microsoft's response during the crisis was revealing. It did not pressure the board. It did not issue statements. It simply made clear that it had options. That clarity was enough. This was not a coup. Coups require force. This was a test. The board tested whether its authority could override the dependencies OpenAI had accumulated. The answer was no. Altman's reinstatement was not a victory. It was a reset to the only stable configuration. OpenAI could not operate without its employees. It could not operate without Microsoft's infrastructure. It could not operate without leadership that both groups accepted. The crisis clarified something that had been true since 2019 but not yet visible. OpenAI's governance structure had authority over strategy and safety decisions, but it did not have control over the organization's ability to continue existing. That control had diffused to the entities that provided compute, talent, and distribution. This was not unique to OpenAI. Any organization that depends on external resources for its operation faces the same constraint. Authority flows from legal structure. Power flows from dependency. When the two diverge, dependency wins. The board's mistake was not firing Altman. The board's mistake was believing that its authority was sufficient to override the dependencies that had accumulated since the Microsoft partnership began. By the time Altman returned, the lesson was clear. The board could govern OpenAI's mission, but it could not govern OpenAI in a way that conflicted with Microsoft's interests or employees' expectations. OpenAI was founded on the premise that artificial intelligence should not be controlled by any single entity. The governance structure was designed to prevent capture. The nonprofit board would ensure that the technology served humanity, not shareholders or governments or any concentrated interests. That premise is no longer operative. OpenAI cannot be neutral because neutrality requires independence, and independence requires the ability to function without relying on entities whose interests may not align with yours. OpenAI lost that ability the moment it became dependent on Microsoft's infrastructure, capital, and distribution. The board still exists. It still has the legal authority to oversee the organization, but that authority now operates within constraints the board cannot unilaterally remove. OpenAI cannot migrate off Azure without disrupting its operations for months. It cannot reclaim enterprise distribution without rebuilding sales infrastructure from scratch. It cannot replace Microsoft's compute subsidies without finding another partner willing to fund billions in infrastructure costs. These are not temporary obstacles. They are structural realities. Microsoft is not holding OpenAI hostage. It is simply providing resources that OpenAI cannot afford to lose. Safety governance was supposed to be the mechanism that preserved OpenAI's mission. If the technology became too powerful or too dangerous, the board could slow down or shut down development. That power was meant to be absolute. It still exists on paper, but exercising it now means conflicting with a partner that has made itself indispensable. If the board pauses development for safety reasons, Microsoft does not stop. It has access to OpenAI's models. It has the talent pipeline. It has the infrastructure. It can continue with or without OpenAI's participation. This does not mean Microsoft is reckless. It means that OpenAI's safety governance is no longer structurally independent. It operates within a framework where the most significant decisions require alignment with a partner whose primary obligation is not to humanity in the abstract, but to its own shareholders and strategic position. The hybrid structure OpenAI created in 2019 was supposed to allow the organization to raise capital without losing its mission. The for-profit subsidiary would attract investment. The nonprofit parent would retain control. It did not preserve independence. It formalized dependence. The for-profit entity created obligations that the nonprofit could not ignore. Obligations to perform, obligations to grow, obligations to maintain partnerships that made performance and growth possible. OpenAI is no longer a research lab with a safety mission. It is infrastructure. Enterprises depend on its models. Developers build on its APIs. Microsoft has integrated its technology into products used by hundreds of millions of people. This is not a failure. It is success. But success at this scale creates commitments that cannot be unwound by governance decisions alone. Infrastructure is not neutral. Infrastructure serves the entities that control access to it. OpenAI still controls its models, but Microsoft controls how those models reach most users. That distribution layer is where influence converts to control. The board could still attempt to reassert independence. It could refuse to renew the Microsoft partnership. It could migrate to a different cloud provider. It could rebuild enterprise distribution. These actions are all technically possible. They are also operationally unaffordable. The cost is not just financial, it is temporal. Competitors do not wait while you restructure. This is why neutrality collapses once dependency exists. Neutrality is not a value you hold. It is a condition you maintain by avoiding entanglements that constrain your decisions. OpenAI entered those entanglements intentionally. It needed capital. It needed compute. It needed scale. The structure it built to raise those resources made independence unsustainable. The crisis in November 2023 clarified what had already occurred. The board believed it governed OpenAI. It discovered that it governed OpenAI only within the boundaries defined by dependencies it could not remove. Authority that cannot be exercised independently is not sovereignty. It is conditional governance. Microsoft did not seize control of OpenAI. It did not need to. Control transferred gradually through a series of reasonable decisions that each made sense in isolation but cumulatively shifted leverage. The investment made sense. The Azure exclusivity made sense. The compute credits made sense. The IP access made sense. Each decision optimized for a local problem. Together, they created a global dependency. OpenAI's leadership understands this. The organization is not resisting Microsoft. It is aligning with Microsoft because alignment is the only stable equilibrium. Resistance would require sacrificing the resources that make OpenAI's roadmap viable. This is not corruption, it is adaptation. OpenAI adapted to the constraints its own structure created. Those constraints are not removable through personnel changes or governance reforms. They are embedded in the operational dependencies that define how the organization functions. The original mission has not been abandoned. It has been recontextualized. OpenAI still aims to ensure that artificial general intelligence benefits humanity, but it now pursues that mission as part of an ecosystem where Microsoft's interests are inseparable from its own. This outcome was not inevitable because of personalities. It was not inevitable because of malice. It was inevitable because of structure. OpenAI built a governance model that could not sustain independence at the scale required to matter. It built a system where authority resided in a board that could not generate the resources needed to act autonomously. The result is an organization that retains its stated mission but no longer has the operational independence to pursue that mission in ways that conflict with the interests of the entities it depends on. OpenAI did not lose control. It finished transferring it.